QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Add normal expenses to books from bank feed Limbo. In other words, we've got the information into our system directly from the bank using the bank feeds, but they're in bank feed Limbo, are not included yet in the financial statements. We're going to add some of the major expenses or normal expenses from bank feed Limbo into the financial statements. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in our bank feeds test drive file. We currently have the open windows open. You can open the open windows by going to the view dropdown, selecting the open windows list. In prior presentations, we've entered information from our bank into the systems in the format of bank feeds. So now we have information so we can look at the bank feeds. We're going to be adding the expense side or a few of the expenses to our books now. So we're going to go to the banking dropdown. We're going to go to the bank feeds. We're going to go to the bank feed center, which will only be there if you have a connection to the bank feeds or have uploaded information from the bank. And then we're going to go and skip that last window. I'm going to maximize the screen here. And then here we have our bank feeds. We went over the overview of just basically this window now. All of our bank feeds are in uncategorized because this is the first time that we've done the bank feeds. And now we have to provide more information, which would include the account that needs to be utilized in order to record the transaction. That's the main thing QuickBooks need. QuickBooks knows, in other words, that it's an increase or decrease to the checking account. There's got to be at least 2 accounts affected. So the minimum that the system needs is another account in this window here. And once you add some more accounts, then you can add rules so QuickBooks can memorize the transaction and help it in the future, which will automate the transaction more and more as you go into the future. Now remember, right now, there's nothing that's included in the financial statements. In other words, if I was to open the reports, let's go to the reports, company and financial profit and loss report. Going to change the date up top from 01/01/20 to 12/31/20. Nothing's in there. And if I go to the reports drop down, company and financial, take a look at the balance sheet standard. I'm going to change the date up top so we can use the auto zoom function from 01/01/20 to 12/31/20, and nothing is included there. It's also useful to open the trial balance, which is basically the balance sheet and income statement on top of each other without the subtotal, so you can see everything kind of in one place there, which is kind of nice. So that's in the accounting and taxes trial balance, changing the dates up top once again from 01/01/20 to 12/31/20, nothing there. So we have all this information in the bank feeds, nothing's on our financial statements yet. We're going to add it now. So usually when I'm here, then I would go to the cog to the right, make sure that you have everything checked off. I like to have everything there. If my screen is large enough to see everything, I'll include all the information that would be provided from the bank. Everything's into this uncategorized area because we haven't categorized anything yet. It's the first month of operations. In next month or in the second month, we'll have some information that we can set up rules which will allow us to basically make the second month of data input much easier. Now, you can sort this a couple different ways you can sort it. First, I would think about it in terms of adding the deposits possibly, and then adding the decreases, and I would do that basically per month. That's one way you can think of entering the transactions. I would do it on a month-by-month basis. If you're entering a whole year's worth of transactions, you might want to think about doing it basically month by month, and then reconciling and doing the next month, right? You could do it a little bit faster by basically sorting your data by the name here and possibly just putting everything that's in the same category in place. But if you mess something up, then of course you didn't reconcile it. You don't have that surety of reconciliating before you go to the second month. So there's a couple options you could do if you're entering a whole bunch of data. One would be, you can go a little bit slower and reconcile each month, but that will give you more assurance that you're doing things right as you go from month to month. Or you can basically batch all your accounts into the same input field and then basically add them all at one time, which could be a lot faster. But then again, you're adding multiple months at one time, and then you'd have to reconcile all in a row if you're doing a whole year's worth of data. So then you can use the filter here. And if you wanted to filter it, then you can filter by date. So as we saw last time, I could sort this way and then filter it by the date. So I could enter it then month by month and then basically just reconcile to make sure I have everything kind of cleared for the first month and whatnot in that way. So then the other way you can do it is sort by basically the type over here, which again will sort by either check or deposit, which is nice, which will line up your checks and or deposits. So I'm actually gonna sort it by basically date right now, and then because I want to look at it as different deposits come up, and then instead of sorting it by basically the name, and then I'm gonna remove all the deposits. So I'm gonna go to the cog here. I'm going to go to the filter, and I'm going to say that I just want the checks. So I want the checks only. So now I have the checks. Now, if I was to hit the filter tab up top, remember it might, if I was to hit the alignment tab for like the names, it might throw off the filtering option. So just be aware of that. So now I'm going to be looking for the expenses like utility or phone bill, those expenses that will be repetitive from month to month. So like the SoCal Gas Company is a great example because every time I see that, I expect it to basically go to the utility. So what do I need to add into the system? I got to add the account, which would probably be utilities expense. And I also want to make sure to add the vendor, which is going to be, we could put in the payee window here. You might be tempted not to add the vendor. You don't really need, you may not need the vendor basically to record the transaction. But if you don't put in the vendor, then you have less sorting data when you go back and want to look for types of things and sort. You can't really sort who you paid. You can't sort it by vendor. You can try to sort your data by the account, by utilities, but you won't be able to sort it as much if you do not add the vendor. So I want to add the vendors. I'm going to say add. And notice how you can do this all on the one screen without having to go into it over here with the added detail, which is really nice. I'm going to add the vendor, and then I'm going to add the vendor. I'm just going to type in the same thing here. Now, it would be nice if you can copy and paste this. You can't do that. You can't highlight and copy it, so I've got to type it in there. So I'll call it SoCal Gas. Let's keep it at that, and then I'm going to save it there. I'm going to put the company name down there, and that's it. That's all I'm going to add. That's all you need for most of the vendors. You might want more information for your major vendors here, but that's going to be the information I need, and that allows me to sort by vendor. So I'm going to say OK. And now when I go to my vendor dropdown, for example, vendors up top, and I go to my vendor center, then I'll see that now I have a vendor. I have a vendor there. That's important because that allows me to run reports by vendor. So let's go back to the bank feeds. And so then I need an account. Now notice in the chart of accounts, when I hit the lists drop down chart of accounts, we purposely added no accounts so that we can add accounts as we go. Now these are going to be the simple kind of accounts to add when they're normal expense type accounts. So I'm just going to add an account. I'm going to say new account, and I'm going to call it utilities. So it's going to say utilities. And that's basically all we need for that item. We don't need a description or a sub account really, and the tax mapping isn't useful most of the time. So I'm going to say save. And so there we have that. And that means that in our chart of accounts now, if we go back to our chart of accounts, we now have utilities. Utilities has now been included. Back to the bank feeds. And so then we can add this transaction. Now this transaction is one that I would expect to be repetitive, however. So I also want to kind of memorize or make what we call a rule with this transaction. To do the rule, I'm going to click on the drop down and add more details to it. And we could see that same information in this screen, utilities. And then I want to go down here and say create a rule for it. So within the rule screen, I'll just call it utilities. And then and maybe the payee name would be the best thing to call it, SoCal Gas rule, and it's a money out. So when the transaction meets all of these restrictions, you may not need all, you may need basically any of the restrictions, because every time SoCal Gas is included, I basically want to add it. So the description is going to be the description, amount, or memo. So I'm going to keep the description because I want to base the rule on SoCal Gas. And then it could say matches, begins, or contains. Contains is probably sufficient enough. So notice it gave me the most restrictive conditions, which could work in this case. But in some of these cases, you might have like numbers next to it or something like that. So in this case, I want to be less restrictive. I just want to say, hey, look, everything that has SoCal Gas in it, I want to put to utilities. Now, in some cases, you might want to be more restrictive. You might have like SoCal Gas for different locations. And any one of these conditions that are then allowing you to differentiate between will allow you to basically set up two rules to go to the different locations of the SoCal Gas if you have different accounts, like sub accounts that are set up. So then do this, rename Payee to SoCal Gas. So if it was something other than SoCal Gas, like if I had the whole extension, it would be renamed to the Payee or vendor SoCal Gas, and then it would record the other side to utilities. That would be recording the transaction to utilities expense. So I'm going to say save and add. So once I add this, now it'll go to the financial. So I'm going to say save and add. This transaction is more than 90 days past due. That's okay. I'm going to say go ahead and record it. And then if we go to our reports, if I go to the balance sheet now, this data, I'm going to say yes. And so there we have it. So now we've got the 25 decrease to the checking account. Now notice I don't have a negative balance in the checking account, obviously, but the beginning balance isn't in the checking account. I'm only adding the activity. So I'm going to have to go back at the end of this process and add the beginning balance to the checking account. The other side is in net income because it's on the income statement. So if we go back to the P&L, profit and loss, I'm going to say yes. There's the 25 in the utilities. Notice if I double click on that, there's our data. They put it in the system as a check form. Notice it wasn't a check. It wasn't an actual physical check, but the check form is the form that's used for the decrease in the checking account. So I'm going to double click on that, and it takes us not to the bank feeds, but to a check form. Again, it wasn't a check, and we didn't enter it as a check, but the check form is what QuickBooks will use to have a decrease to the checking account. The check form means decrease to the checking account. You can see the transaction here, the same data in a different format. Checking accounts going down. The utilities is the other side in the expense category, and we have our memo information up top. So let's close this back out and say, okay, I'm gonna close this back out, and that looks good. And then let's go back to our bank feeds. Now notice the bank feeds now has some items in recognized transactions. So if I go to recognized transactions, it's got these two other applied out based on the rule. So I've got those applied out, and I can assign the rule to it. So I'll take a look at that, and we'll do that in a future presentation. I'm going to let the rules basically stack up, and we'll go back over here. We also have the item that had been added. So we started with 55 items. We have an item added now, and here's the item that we added through this process. So back to the unrecorded items. So then I'm going to go back to, I'm going to hit the filter again. I'm sorry, the filter. And then I'm going to say checks, and then okay. So that's what I want. Clear the filter. Or go away filter. See, sometimes it could be a little finicky with this thing. So I want the checks. Okay, there it goes. So now, Primerica, this is an insurance. So insurance might be another one that we could expect to be basically the same. I'll assume it's like a general liability insurance. Now the insurance, if I pay it monthly, maybe I just write it to an expense. But if I pay it on insurance generally will go into an asset. If you're doing an accrual basis, you'd put it into an asset account, and then you'd have to write it down in the future. You'd have to write it down as you consume the insurance. So if you're paying it monthly, then you might get away with just basically expensing it. And so let's try to do that here, just to have another example of this. So I'm going to do the same thing. So we have the information. Now I want to pick up the Payee, which is usually basically part of this here. So I'm going to say Payee. I want to put a vendor together, new vendor. So I'm going to say vendor, and the vendor I'm going to just say is Primerica Life Insurance. I'm going to say it's general liability insurance, but we'll say Primerica Life, and then I'm going to copy that, and we're going to put that here, and there's our vendor. So I'm going to say okay. So we just created a vendor as we went. If I went to the vendor center here, now we have another vendor, so we could sort our information by vendor back to the bank feeds. And then I have here the accounts, and then I'm going to set up an account now. I'm going to just call it an expense. I'm not going to put it into prepaid insurance. If you wanted to go through prepaid insurance and then adjust it, you'd have to put it in there as a asset account. I'm just going to expense it, which is the easiest thing to do. So I'm going to call it insurance expense. And we probably would want, like, depending on how complicated your system is, you might want insurance and then subcategories of the type of insurance, like liability insurance and whatnot, that would go under that categorization. But I'm going to put it into a general insurance expense here. and save that. And then again, this is something that I would expect to happen over and over again, so I could set a rule up here. So I'm going to go to the drop down and say, let's add more detail. And you could change the memo to, so like it says July, you might say something like, July insurance, you could put the period that's going to be here. You could change the memo, in other words, if you want to. And that'll show up when you drill down on the data on the check, you'll see the memo. So then I'm going to say, let's create a rule with this. And I'm going to say, let's call this Primerica Life. Primerica Life. Primerica Life. So let's do that. If I can, okay, and it's money out rule. So it says when transactions meet all of these conditions. So notice I have one condition here. So you could add another condition by going here, and we can have multiple conditions that it can meet, all of them. Or I could have multiple conditions and it meets basically one of them or any of them. If I go from all to any right now, it doesn't really matter because I only have one condition that's going to be here. I could add another one. So then we have the description, amount, or memo. I usually want the description. Now, do we want it to match exactly, or do we want to have it contains? I still think it's okay to have it contains, but I'm not going to bring it down to simply Primerica now, because now I have Primerica Life versus another Primerica account that we will be using. So, and also note that if you go to the vendor section over here, we might, I can't go over there right now, but we may have set the vendor section up with simply Primerica as the vendor, which might be handling two different things. So you'd have one vendor that has two accounts that it could be going to. If you have Primerica going to two different things, you might it might be easier for you for your sorting purposes to, even though it's one vendor, set it up slightly differently, like Primerica Life or Primerica something else, so that you can then have the vendors will sort it out differently as well. So you can have the vendor details sorted out by vendor in two different categories. So I want to bring it down to Primerica Life, and that should be enough. And I want to have it contain that. And then I'm going to rename it when it does that to Primerica Life Insurance. So that's where it goes to. So instead of that's what we set up the vendor as. So instead of me just calling it Primerica, we called it Primerica Life. So I'm going to have two vendors that are basically Primerica when I go to the other kinds of transactions that will sort by the type of transactions we're dealing with within them. And then we got the insurance expense, which is the other side of the transaction. So I'm going to say save. And once I save it here, it's going to add it. So I'm going to say save and add it. I'm going to say yes, that's fine. And now if I go to my balance sheet and say, okay, we've got two transactions now. So if I double click on this, we've got our two transactions in here, closing that back out. If we go to the profit and loss, then we've got now our insurance transaction, double clicking on that. There it is, double clicking on that. Takes us to the check form, which is the decrease to the account form, the cash account form. And the other side is going to insurance expense with our memo that we added to the right-hand side. Closing this back out, and closing this back out, and closing this back out. Well, not that one. Let's save that. We'll keep that one there. Okay, and then I'm going to go back to the bank feeds. Let's go back into the bank feeds, and I'm going to go ahead and filter again. I want to filter by the checks, so just see the checks, and then I'll close that out. Now, this Primerica is going to be something else, and I'm going to call this Primerica 1 inventory so that we can kind of think about what to do with inventory, even though it's not in real life, but it'll inventory. And then this one's going to be, this is going to be a transfer. So let's imagine that we have a company account that's transferring then to the private account. So that would be like a withdrawal kind of. So I'll deal with that one later. That's going to be a little bit different than an expense. This one's Verizon Wireless. That's a telephone company. So that one should be a pretty straightforward one to add. So I'm going to say, all right, same thing here. We've got the payee that we can add. I'm going to add the payee. I'm just going to say it's going to be a vendor, and it's just going to be Verizon Wireless. So I'm just going to type in Verizon Wireless, and I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to put that down here in the company and say okay. So now we added the vendor over here. If I go to the vendor center Now we have Verizon Wireless has been added, and so that looks good. Bank feeds, back to the bank feeds. We're going to say the other account, I'm just going to call as a telephone expense. So I'm going to add the accounts as I go. It's going to say telephone. You could put it into utilities again if you want, but I'm going to say telephone expense. And expense is a little redundant because it's an expense account, but it's just some accounts just feel like you need to have an expense behind it, right? Telephone expense or just telephone, and it's an expense type. You know, some people will have opinions on that kind of thing, but either way is okay. So I'm going to say save and close. And then I expect this to be reoccurring. So I'm going to hit the drop down. I'm going to say, let's edit or add more details to it. And now again, you could put the memo here. This memo is not too helpful for me. I might say this for the month of, or something like that. July, or I might put the billing period or something like that in here. And then I'm going to say that we want to have a rule. So let's add the rule. And I'm going to name the rule Verizon Wireless Rule. And money out, all conditions, because there's only one condition, will be fine. It's going to be based on the description, not the amount or memo. It's going to be matching. I think contains is enough. And I just need Verizon, really. Verizon is probably enough of a rule. If you want a more restrictive rule, then again, you can have more there. But like I say, if it had Verizon, I'm going to assume it's a telephone bill. So that's all I need for it to contain that. And then I'm going to say it's going to rename it to Verizon Wireless, the vendor, and it's going to go to telephone expense. That's what we want. That's what I want to see. Let's save it. It'll add it to our data then. I'm going to say OK. And then let's go to our balance sheet. And so now within our checking account, we have the activity Verizon bill there. Closing that back out. If we go to the P&L, profit and loss, this is being built as well. There's the telephone, double clicking on that. There it is. Double clicking on that. We're going to get down to our actual check. There's our actual check, expense side, and the check decreasing the checking account. Closing this back out. Closing this back out. Then also note that if we go to the trial balance, you can see all this kind of on one system, so you can see this thing being built as you go. And obviously, if we go to the chart of accounts, we've now added these accounts to the telephone and the utilities account, the insurance expense, and so on. Let's go back to the bank feeds. So now we have the 46 transactions here. Notice it's found another couple recognized transactions in our data set from the rule that was applied. So now we've got our rules. The SoCal rule picked this one up. The Primerica rule, the Verizon rule, SoCal rule, Primerica rule. So these, you can see how the next month, the second month that we do, we could basically just add these. These are just going to be nice and easy. I can just add them in. I know where they go. And that's when things become basically more automated into the system. So if I go back into the unrecognized transactions, so now I'm gonna filter and I'm gonna put the checks back on, closing this back out. So if I go back down, we got this one. I'm gonna say this one's gonna be inventory, so that we can practice basically what are we gonna do about inventory type of transaction there. And then we have an online transfer, online transfer, American Express. These are going to be credit cards. And notice you can have bank feeds for credit cards. So we'll talk more about that, because you're going to be like, well, what happens if I have a bank feed on the credit card side and a bank feed on the checking side? So we'll talk more about that. And then we have the Primerica transactions, which we're going to pretend are inventory. And then we got the credit card. Again, the credit card auto pay. All we see in the checking account with the credit card is a payment. So we'll have to deal with that as well. Because, if we want more detail than just credit card expense, we're going to have to add the credit card detail. And then we have I'm going to assume that this is a purchase of property, plant, and equipment, so that we can practice that. So it's not going to be like a normal bill. And then we have the Primerica activity as well. Okay, so we'll stop it there for now. We'll go back to this information in the next presentation.